Blood dripped from the warbeast's jaws, its massive, shadow-black frame towering over the trembling girl in the center of the arena. This was the Alpha King's ultimate weapon, a monstrous, ancient direwolf that bowed to no one, not even the king himself. Without the threat of a silver whip, the entire pack held their breath, waiting for the inevitable, sickening snap of bone. But the crunch never came. Instead, the beast lowered its massive head, scraping its snout against the blood-soaked dirt, and whimpered softly. It folded its front legs and bowed to the bruised Omega holding a serving tray. The arena plunged into a deafening, terrifying silence. A scent of bleach and stale copper was permanently etched into Nora Hastings's skin. No matter how hard she scrubbed her hands with the harsh, lye-based soap provided in the servants' quarters, the phantom smell of the fighting pits clung to her. She was 21 years old, but her body ached with the exhaustion of a woman 3 times her age. In the Iron Ridge Pack, the largest and most ruthless werewolf syndicate in the Northern Hemisphere, being an Omega wasn't just a rank, it was a life sentence of invisible servitude. Nora dipped her heavy bristle brush into the bucket of steaming, chemically treated water and dropped to her hands and knees on the cold, unforgiving stone of the arena floor. The midday sun beat down through the massive iron grate above, casting grid-like shadows across the dried bloodstains she was tasked with removing. Her knees, wrapped in rags that offered little padding, screamed in protest. "Missed a spot, Hastings." A sharp, sneering voice echoed through the empty amphitheater. Nora didn't need to look up to know it was Seraphina Frost. Seraphina was the daughter of the pack's lead financier, a high-ranking Delta female with a cruelty that matched her flawless, icy beauty. She stood at the edge of the pit, flanked by 2 of her sycophantic friends, tossing a handful of sunflower seeds into the freshly scrubbed section Nora had just finished. "Clean it up," Seraphina demanded, a cruel smile playing on her lips. "The Alpha King returns from the border wars tonight. The Solstice Gala is tomorrow, and the arena must be immaculate for the executions. If Damien sees a single speck of filth, I'll make sure your rations are cut for a month." Nora gritted her teeth, keeping her head bowed. "Yes, Lady Seraphina." She crawled over to the seeds, picking them up one by one with freezing, wet fingers. She couldn't afford a ration cut, not with Toby. Her 7-year-old little brother was currently huddled beneath thin blankets in their drafty basement room, battling a chest infection that refused to clear. Since their parents had been killed in a rogue ambush 5 years ago, leaving behind a massive debt to the pack for their funeral rites and medical care, Nora had borne the weight of their survival alone. Omegas weren't allowed pack doctors. They were allowed to work, pay off their debts, and die quietly. As Seraphina's mocking laughter faded down the corridor, Nora sat back on her heels and wiped the sweat from her forehead, leaving a streak of gray soot across her pale skin. A sudden, earth-shattering roar vibrated through the stone floor, rattling the heavy metal bucket beside her. Nora froze, her heart hammering against her ribs. Deep beneath the arena, in the subterranean holding cells fortified with titanium and silver-laced concrete, the warbeast was awake. No one knew exactly what Krieger was. He wasn't a werewolf. When Alpha King Damien Cross had decimated the rival northern packs 3 years ago, he had found the beast chained in a subterranean glacial cave. Krieger was a remnant of something ancient, a massive, quadrupedal nightmare of muscle, matted black fur, and razor-sharp bone spurs protruding from his spine. He was the size of a draft horse, with jaws that could snap a grown werewolf in half with a single bite. Damien had claimed the beast as his own, a living symbol of his absolute, terrifying dominance. Another roar shook the foundations. The sound was filled with a primal rage that made Nora's wolf a small, repressed thing deep inside her whimper in absolute terror. "He smells the blood," a low, gruff voice said. Nora turned to see Beta Jackson Ward standing at the entrance of the tunnel. Unlike the other high-ranking members, Jackson rarely went out of his way to torment the Omegas, though his indifference was just as cold. He was staring at the floor, his jaw tight. "The Alpha King approaches the gates," Jackson announced, his eyes finally drifting to Nora. He took in her soaked, ragged clothing and the exhaustion painting dark circles under her hazel eyes. "Finish this sector and get out of sight, Hastings. The king is bringing the beast up to the surface to acclimate him before tomorrow's festival. You don't want to be in the crosshairs when Krieger sees the sky." Nora nodded quickly, her hands trembling as she grabbed her brush. "Yes, Beta Jackson. Right away." She scrubbed furiously, her muscles burning. The stories of the Alpha King were the stuff of nightmares among the servant class. Damien Cross had inherited the throne at 25, after his father was poisoned by a rival Alpha. In the 3 years since, Damien had eradicated his enemies with a brutal, calculating efficiency. He was known as the Iron King, unmated, unyielding, and completely devoid of mercy. It was heavily rumored that during the solstice gala tomorrow, he would finally choose a Luna to secure his lineage, and Seraphina Frost was the loudest, most aggressive candidate for the crown. Nora finished the last of the bloodstains and hauled her heavy bucket toward the servants' exit. Just as she reached the heavy iron door, she heard the colossal, grinding gears of the main arena gates opening. Against her better judgment, she paused, peering through the small rusted grate in the door. A procession of elite warriors marched in, their faces grim, pulling on massive chains thick as a man's arm. At the center of the formation was Damien Cross. Even from a distance, the sheer aura of his power was suffocating. He was tall, powerfully built, dressed in dark combat gear dusted with the ash of the borderlands. His dark hair was swept back, and his jaw was set in a hard, unforgiving line. But it was what he led that stole the breath from Nora's lungs. Krieger, the beast, emerged from the shadows of the tunnel, fighting the chains with every step. The creature was monstrous, its eyes glowing a sickly radioactive amber. It snapped its jaws, the sound like a steel trap slamming shut, taking a chunk out of a stone pillar as if it were made of chalk. The elite guards strained, their boots skidding on the stone. But Damien held the primary chain wrapped around his heavily gloved hand. With a sharp, violent yank, the Alpha King forced the beast's head down. "Heal," Damien's voice boomed, a deep, commanding alpha frequency that forced Nora to her knees behind the door, her hands flying to her ears to block the overwhelming psychic pressure. Krieger snarled, saliva dripping from his fangs, but he ceased his thrashing, glaring at the Alpha King with barely contained murderous intent. Nora didn't wait to see more. Terrified, she scrambled to her feet and fled down the damp, dimly lit corridor toward the servants' quarters. She had to get back to Toby. The presence of the Alpha King and his monster meant the pack was entirely focused on the upper levels, which meant she might be able to sneak into the infirmary's waste bins to find discarded antibiotics for her brother. In the brutal world of the Iron Ridge pack, survival wasn't about strength for an Omega. It was about remaining entirely, perfectly invisible. The Solstice Gala was a sickening display of excess. While the Omegas survived on watery potato stew and stale bread, the grand balconies of the arena were laden with roasted meats, exotic fruits flown in from the coast, and fountains of sparkling wine. The entire pack, over 2,000 wolves, had gathered in the tiered seating surrounding the massive stone fighting pit. Torches blazed, casting long, dancing shadows across the cheering crowd. Nora was exhausted to the point of collapse. She had been on her feet for 18 hours, carrying massive silver trays of food to the VIP tables on the lower balcony, right above the pit. Her uniform, a simple gray linen dress, clung to her damp skin. "More wine, Omega," a drunken warrior barked, slamming his silver goblet on the table. Nora hurried over, her hands shaking as she poured the heavy red liquid. She kept her eyes glued to the floor, actively ignoring the sneers and whispered insults from the high-born wolves. At the head of the balcony sat the Alpha King's throne. Damien Cross sat with a posture of absolute authority, though his sharp, dark eyes betrayed a deep-seated boredom and irritation. He held a glass of whiskey, watching the festivities with the detached coldness of a predator. To his right stood Seraphina Frost, dressed in a stunning blood-red silk gown that clung to her curves. She was leaning in close to him, laughing loudly at something he hadn't even said, desperate to cement the public illusion that she was his chosen mate. Damien, however, barely looked at her. His gaze kept drifting to the massive iron cage sitting in the center of the arena below. Inside, Krieger paced relentlessly, his massive paws completely silent on the stone. "My king," Beta Jackson's voice cut through the noise as he stepped onto the royal platform. "The rogue prisoners have been prepped. The crowd is getting restless. Shall we begin the execution?" Damien took a slow sip of his whiskey. "Let them loose. 3 at a time. Let's see if the beast is still hungry." Nora shivered, stepping back against the stone wall of the balcony to make herself as small as possible. She hated this part of the festival. She hated the violence, the cheering, the smell of death that would linger in the stones for weak stones she would have to scrub tomorrow. Down in the arena, the heavy iron portcullis lifted. 3 rogues, feral wolves who had been caught trying to infiltrate the borders, were shoved into the pit. They were fully shifted into their wolf forms, snarling and desperate, their eyes darting around for an exit. There was none. With a loud, metallic clank, the cage in the center of the arena fell open. Krieger didn't run. The war beast stepped out slowly, his amber eyes locking onto the 3 wolves. He was twice their size, a walking nightmare of muscle and bone. The crowd erupted into a bloodthirsty roar. Nora closed her eyes, trying to block out the sound, but a sharp shove to her shoulder sent her stumbling forward. "Watch where you're standing. Trash," Serafina hissed, having stepped away from the king's table to grab a fresh glass of champagne. She glared at Nora with absolute disdain. "You're blocking the view." "I apologize, Lady Serafina," Nora whispered, bowing her head and trying to step back. But Serafina wasn't done. Annoyed by Damien's lack of attention, she needed a target for her frustration. As Nora tried to move past her with a tray of empty crystal glasses, Serafina subtly jutted her high-heeled foot out. Nora tripped. She pitched forward, crying out as the heavy silver tray flew from her hands. The crystal glasses shattered spectacularly against the stone floor of the balcony, sending a shower of sharp shards in every direction. The loud crash drew the attention of the surrounding tables. The music seemed to stutter. "You clumsy, worthless bitch!" Serafina shrieked, dramatically brushing non-existent glass from her red dress. "She did that on purpose. She tried to throw glass at me." Damien Cross slowly turned his head, his dark eyes locking onto the commotion. Nora was on her hands and knees, frantically trying to sweep up the broken glass with her bare hands, blood already welling from shallow cuts on her palms. I'm so sorry, I tripped." "You tripped because you are incompetent," Serafina spat. She turned to one of the massive guards standing near the balcony ledge. "Throw her over. Let her clean the pit from the inside." The guard hesitated, looking toward the Alpha King for confirmation. Damien simply watched, his expression unreadable, though a muscle in his jaw ticked. He didn't care about a clumsy servant, nor did he care about Serafina's petty tantrums. He remained silent, taking the Alpha's silence as permission. The guard stepped forward and grabbed Nora by the back of her uniform. "No, please," Nora screamed, her voice cracking with terror as her feet left the ground. She thought of Toby, lying sick in his bed. If she died, he would starve. "Please, my brother." "I have a brother." The crowd laughed, the sound cruel and jagged. Below, the fight was already over. Krieger stood over the mangled remains of the three rogues, his muzzle dripping with dark blood. The beast whipped his massive head upward, alerted by Nora's scream. With a heave, the guard tossed Nora over the low stone wall of the balcony. She fell 15 feet, her body hitting the packed dirt and blood of the arena floor with a sickening thud. The wind was violently knocked from her lungs. Pain exploded in her shoulder and ribs. She gasped for air, her vision swimming with dark spots, the taste of copper flooding her mouth. The cheers of the crowd abruptly morphed into excited, frenzied shrieking. They had a new piece of entertainment. Nora forced her eyes open, coughing as she tried to push herself up. 10 yards away, the warbeast turned entirely away from his kills. His glowing amber eyes locked onto her small, broken form. Krieger let out a low, rumbling growl that vibrated through the earth, shaking the very marrow in Nora's bones. On the balcony, Damien Cross suddenly stood up. The moment Nora had hit the ground, a scent had drifted up into the night air. It wasn't the metallic tang of fear or the sourness of the rogues. It was the scent of rain-washed pine, sweet vanilla, and something electric that made the Alpha King's heart violently slam against his ribs. His wolf, dormant and ruthlessly controlled for years, suddenly thrashed wildly against his ribcage, howling a single desperate word into his mind. Mate. Damien's eyes widened in sheer, unadulterated shock, locking onto the bleeding girl in the dirt. The Omega. And then, Krieger charged her. The beast moved with a terrifying speed, a blur of black shadow and lethal muscle tearing across the arena. "Krieger, halt!" Damien roared. The Alpha King's voice boomed with such staggering dominance that several wolves in the front rows collapsed, clutching their heads in pain. It was a command meant to bend reality to his will. But Krieger was not a werewolf. He did not operate on the pack's psychic network. He was a creature of blood and instinct, and his bloodlust was fully ignited. He ignored the king entirely, covering the distance to Nora in seconds. Nora couldn't run. Her shoulder was dislocated from the fall, hanging uselessly at her side. She looked up at the towering monster bearing down on her, its jaws unhinged, revealing rows of serrated, blood-stained teeth. "Toby," she thought, tears finally spilling hot and fast down her dirty cheeks. "I'm so sorry, Toby." She didn't scream. She didn't cower. She simply closed her eyes, wrapping her good arm around her ribs, and waited for the dark. Damien vaulted over the balcony. He didn't care about the drop. He didn't care about the thousands of eyes watching him. His fangs descended, his claws elongating as he hit the dirt, sprinting toward the beast with a speed that defied logic. But he was too far. He wasn't going to make it. "No!" Damien bellowed, a sound of pure, agonizing despair. Krieger leaped into the air, a shadow blotting out the torches, descending directly upon Nora. But the teeth never tore into her flesh. A foot away from her face, Krieger slammed his front paws into the dirt, breaking so hard he kicked up a massive cloud of dust and blood-soaked sand. The momentum carried him forward until his giant snout was mere inches from Nora's trembling face. The arena fell dead silent. The cheers evaporated. The music died. 2,000 wolves froze in utter disbelief. Nora squeezed her eyes shut tighter, feeling the hot, wet breath of the monster washing over her face, smelling the raw stench of the slaughtered rogues. She trembled violently, waiting. Krieger leaned in. He pressed his wet nose against her neck, right over her pulse point. He inhaled deeply, a loud, snuffling sound that echoed in the silent amphitheater. He sniffed her hair, her tears, the faint scent of the cheap lye soap, and the ancient, hidden bloodline buried deep within her DNA. Then, the impossible happened. The monstrous war beast, a creature that had torn through entire armies and refused to yield to the most powerful alpha in the hemisphere, let out a soft, high-pitched whine. Krieger took a step back. He lowered his massive, terrifying head until his chin scraped the dirt. He folded his front legs, bowing his upper body entirely to the ground, his ears pinned back flat against his skull, and he nudged Nora's broken, bleeding hand with his nose, licking the blood from her knuckles with surprising, terrifying gentleness. He was submitting to her. The silence in the arena was absolute. It was a suffocating, heavy quiet, broken only by the crackle of the torches. Up on the balcony, Serafina Frost's jaw hung completely slack, her champagne glass slipping from her fingers and shattering on the stone. Damien skidded to a halt 10 feet away. His chest heaved, his eyes wide, his alpha aura flaring uncontrollably. He stared at the beast bowing in the dirt, and then his gaze shifted to the tiny, terrified Omega curled up on the ground. Nora slowly opened her hazel eyes. She stared at the giant black wolf pressing its head into the dirt before her. Her breathing was shallow, jagged. She hesitantly reached out her uninjured, shaking hand and let her fingers graze the coarse, dark fur of the beast's snout. Krieger rumbled, a deep purr that vibrated the ground, and closed his glowing amber eyes, leaning into her touch. Damien took a slow, deliberate step forward. The sheer intensity rolling off him made the air crackle with static electricity. "Who are you?" Damien's voice was barely a whisper, yet it carried through the silent arena like a gunshot. Nora looked up at the Alpha King. Up close, he was terrifying. His eyes were entirely pitch black, his wolf completely pushed to the surface, driven mad by the scent of his mate bleeding in the dirt. I'm Nora," she whispered, her voice cracking. "Please, don't kill me." Damien didn't look at Krieger. He didn't look at the thousands of pack members watching in stunned horror. He dropped to his knees in the dirt right beside her, uncaring of the blood staining his dark trousers. He reached out, his massive, calloused hands hovering over her broken body, as if terrified she was an illusion that would shatter if he touched her. "Kill you?" Damien breathed, his voice rough, thick with an emotion no one in the Iron Ridge pack had ever heard from their ruthless king. He gently touched her cheek, wiping away a streak of dirt and tears with his thumb. A jolt of electricity snapped between their skin, making Nora gasp. "You are my mate," Damien declared, his voice rising, carrying the absolute, undeniable weight of alpha law. He stood up, scooping her fragile, broken body into his arms with terrifying gentleness. Nora cried out softly as her dislocated shoulder shifted. Damien turned his blazing, pitch-black eyes toward the royal balcony, locking his gaze directly onto Serafina Frost and the guard who had thrown Nora over the edge. "And whoever laid a hand on my queen," Damien's voice dropped to a lethal, demonic register, "will not live to see the sunrise." Krieger, standing up behind them, let out a massive, blood-curdling roar of agreement, stepping protectively behind the bleeding Omega in the Alpha's arms. The Solstice Gala was over. The bloodbath was just beginning. The air in the arena grew impossibly thin, stifled by the crushing, suffocating weight of Damien Cross's alpha aura. It was a tangible force, a pressure that forced the weaker wolves in the upper balconies to their knees, gasping for breath. He stood in the blood-soaked dirt of the pit, holding Nora Hastings against his chest as if she were made of spun glass. Her head rested weakly against his armor, her breathing shallow and ragged, The searing pain in her dislocated right shoulder was nauseating, but the terrifying warmth radiating from the Alpha King was overriding her shock. Sparks of electricity, the undeniable, biological signature of the mating bond, danced across her skin wherever he touched her. Braddock. Damien's voice was a low, terrifying rumble that carried perfectly in the dead silence. On the royal balcony, the massive guard who had thrown Nora over the edge visibly flinched, the color completely drained from his face. He stepped back, his hands raised in a futile gesture of surrender. "My king, I was only following Lady Seraphina's orders." The Omega was insubordinate. She threw glass. "You threw my queen into a pit of death," Damien interrupted, his tone devoid of any emotion. "It was the absolute calm before a catastrophic storm. You took orders from a Delta when your oath was sworn to me." Damien didn't even raise his voice. He didn't need to. He simply shifted his gaze to Beta Jackson Ward, who was already leaping down the stone tiers toward the balcony. "Take him," Damien commanded softly, "and take Seraphina Frost. Throw them in the subterranean holding cells, the ones lined with silver." Panic erupted. Seraphina let out a piercing shriek as two of Jackson's elite enforcers grabbed her by the arms, dragging her away from the velvet-lined VIP tables. "Get your hands off me!" Seraphina screamed, her flawless facade shattering into absolute hysteria. "Damien, you can't do this. My father is Moreau Frost. He finances your entire border defense. You cannot cage me for a filthy, worthless—" Her words were violently cut off as Jackson Ward casually backhanded her across the face, silencing her instantly. "You will not speak of the Luna that way," Jackson growled, hauling her toward the heavy iron doors. Braddock, the guard, didn't even fight. He simply wept, knowing his execution was already a certainty. In the pit, Nora let out a sharp gasp, her fingers clutching the dark fabric of Damien's shirt. Her vision was blurring at the edges, the shock of the fall finally taking its toll on her malnourished body. "Shh, I have you," Damien whispered, his terrifying demeanor instantly softening as he looked down at her. His pitch-black eyes were slowly receding back to their natural, piercing ice blue. "I'm getting you out of here. The pack doctor is waiting." "No," Nora choked out, tears mixing with the soot on her face. She fought to keep her eyes open, terrified that if she passed out, her reality would reset to the nightmare of her daily life. "No, doctor, please. Toby. I have to get to Toby." Damien stopped walking toward the exit gates, his brows furrowed in confusion. "Who is Toby?" "My brother," Nora wheezed, every word sending a spike of agony through her ribs. "He's 7. He's in the basement. Sector D, room 4, the servant quarters. He has a lung infection. He's burning up. Please, don't leave him down there. If I'm not there, he'll die." The sheer desperation in her voice felt like a physical knife twisting in Damien's gut. His mate, his Luna, the most revered position in the pack hierarchy, was begging for the life of a child living in a damp, disease-ridden basement right beneath his feet. A wave of profound, sickening guilt washed over him. He had been so consumed by the border wars and maintaining his ruthless reputation that he had allowed his own pack to rot from the inside out. "Jackson!" Damien roared, halting the Beta at the tunnel entrance. "Deploy a medical extraction team to Sector D, room 4 immediately. There is a child named Toby. I want him brought to the Royal Infirmary, and I want Dr. Harrison Gable waiting for us." "Now," Jackson nodded sharply, tapping his earpiece to issue the commands before vanishing into the shadows. Damien adjusted Nora in his arms, securing her broken frame against him. "He's going to be safe, Nora. I swear it on my life." As Damien strode toward the heavy steel gates of the arena, a massive shadow fell over them. Krieger, the ancient war beast, stepped into stride right beside Damien, his giant, muscular shoulder brushing against the Alpha King's arm. Krieger's glowing amber eyes were locked onto Nora, a low, protective rumble vibrating in his chest. Any pack member who even breathed too loudly as they passed was met with a terrifying, bone-chilling snarl from the monster. The entire Iron Ridge pack watched in stunned, absolute silence as their ruthless king carried a bleeding, soot-covered servant out of the arena, flanked by the deadliest creature on Earth. The hierarchy they had known for centuries had just been obliterated in a matter of minutes. The Royal Infirmary was a stark contrast to the damp, chemical-smelling world Nora had inhabited for the last 5 years. It smelled of clean linen, high-grade antiseptic, and expensive essential oils meant to soothe the wolves' heightened senses. The lighting was soft, and the medical equipment hummed with state-of-the-art precision. Nora lay on a plush, heated medical bed, her right arm secured in a high-tech stabilizing sling. Dr. Harrison Gable, a stern-looking man in his late 50s with graying hair and a meticulously trimmed beard, had just popped her shoulder back into place. The pain had been blinding, but Damien hadn't let go of her left hand for a single second. He sat beside her bed, having completely discarded his royal armor. He wore only a simple black undershirt, his muscular arms resting on the mattress as he kept his eyes locked on her pale face. The dislocation is clean, and there's no severe internal bleeding from the fall, thankfully, Dr. Gable murmured, checking the monitors above her bed. She is severely malnourished, however. Her bone density is frighteningly low, and her immune system is compromised. It's a miracle she survived the impact at all. Damien's jaw clenched so hard a muscle feathered in his cheek. He gently brushed a stray, damp curl from Nora's forehead. Fix it, Harrison. Whatever she needs. I don't care what it costs. Before the doctor could reply, the heavy, automated doors of the infirmary hissed open. 2 elite medical personnel rushed in, pushing a gurney. Lying on it was a tiny, frail boy, his face flushed red with fever, coughing weakly into an oxygen mask. Toby, Nora cried out, trying to sit up, but Damien gently pushed her back down by her good shoulder. Stay still, little wolf, Damien urged softly. Let the doctors work. Dr. Gable immediately moved to the boy's side, running a scanner over his small chest. Severe bilateral pneumonia, the doctor announced grimly, pulling out a syringe of potent, silver-laced antibiotics specifically designed for werewolf biology. His wolf hasn't manifested yet to fight the infection. If you had waited another 24 hours to tell us, my king, he would not have made it. Nora covered her mouth with her good hand, tears streaming down her face as she watched the nurses hook her brother up to IV fluids and monitors. The crushing weight of her 5-year struggle was finally lifting, replaced by an overwhelming, confusing reality. Why are you doing this? Nora whispered, looking up at Damien. Her hazel eyes were wide, filled with a lifetime of distrust. I'm just a servant. I have debts. My parents owed the pack. Your parents owed nothing, Damien interrupted, his voice fiercely protective. The old laws created by my father were designed to enslave the weak. I was blind to how deep the rot went. You are my mate, Nora. You are the other half of my soul. There are no debts. There is only you, and whatever you require. He leaned down, pressing a gentle, lingering kiss to her knuckles. The warmth of his lips sent a rush of comfort straight to her exhausted heart. For the first time in her life, Nora felt entirely, unequivocally safe. Alpha. Dr. Gable's voice broke the quiet intimacy of the room. The doctor was standing by the genomic sequencer in the corner of the lab, holding a digital tablet. His face was completely drained of color, his eyes darting frantically between the screen and Nora. Damien stood up, his protective instincts instantly flaring. What is it, Harrison? Did you find something in her blood work? Dr. Gable swallowed hard, walking over to the bed with trembling hands. I ran a standard genetic panel to ensure she had the biological markers to handle the mating bond with an alpha of your magnitude. But the sequencer flagged an anomaly, a massive one. Speak plainly, Damien growled, his patience wearing thin. She isn't an omega, doctor. Gable breathed, turning the tablet to show Damien the complex double helix rendering on the screen. The DNA strands were highlighted in a brilliant, unusual gold. Her recessive genes. They match a sequence we thought was entirely eradicated during the First Age. My king. Her genetic markers belong to the Volkrad lineage. Damien froze. The air in the room seemed to drop 10 degrees. That's impossible. The Volkrad line was wiped out centuries ago in the Nordic fjords. They were the original royalty, the first shifters. I ran it 3 times, Dr. Gable insisted, his voice hushed with absolute awe. He looked at Nora as if she were a living deity. The markers are undeniable. The Volkrads weren't just alphas. They had a psychic tether to the ancient beasts of the earth. They were the only ones who could command them without force. Damien slowly turned his head, looking through the reinforced glass window of the infirmary doors. Sitting in the middle of the sterile white hallway, taking up almost the entire corridor, was Krieger. The war beast was sitting perfectly still, guarding the door like a loyal hound. That's why Krieger bowed, Damien whispered, the realization hitting him with the force of a freight train. He didn't smell an omega in the dirt. He smelled his true master. He smelled the ancient blood. Nora looked between the 2 men, utterly lost. I don't understand. My parents were normal. We were just workers. They must have been in hiding, Damien murmured, walking back to her side and sitting down heavily. The Volkrad blood is a threat to every reigning alpha in the world. If the other syndicates find out that a true Volkrad heir exists, they won't just challenge me for territory. They will start a global war to either claim you or kill you. Before the weight of that revelation could fully settle, the infirmary doors slid open, and Beta Jackson Ward stepped inside, his expression dark and severe. He completely ignored the usual protocols, walking straight up to Damien. "We have a massive problem, Alpha," Jackson said, keeping his voice low so the nurses wouldn't hear. "I told you to put Serafina in the silver cells," Damien said, his eyes narrowing. "I did," Jackson replied. "But Moreau Frost just breached the armory. He's rallied the Delta class and the financial sector guards. He's locked down the PAC's bank accounts and is barricading the southern wing." Damien's jaw locked. "A coup. He claims you've been bewitched by an Omega witch," Jackson explained grimly. "He says he refuses to let his daughter rot in a cell while you put a servant on the throne. He's demanding we hand Nora over for execution, or he will bankrupt the Iron Ridge PAC and open our borders to the rogue armies." Damien looked down at Nora. She was trembling again, her eyes darting toward her sleeping brother. The peace she had felt for 5 minutes was already shattering. A dark, terrifying smile slowly spread across Damien's face. His eyes flashed pitch black, the alpha beast roaring to the surface, ready for slaughter. He reached down and gently cupped Nora's cheek. "Rest, my Luna," Damien whispered, his thumb brushing her jaw. "Keep her safe, Harrison. If anyone besides Jackson enters this room, you have my permission to use lethal force." Damien turned and walked toward the heavy glass doors. As they slid open, Krieger stood up, his massive bone spurs bristling, sensing the violence radiating from the Alpha King. "Jackson," Damien said, not looking back as he stepped into the hallway. "Tell Moreau Frost he has exactly 10 minutes to surrender his forces and his life, or I won't just kill him. I'll let the beast eat him." The southern wing of the Iron Ridge compound was an architectural fortress, designed specifically to protect the Syndicate's massive wealth and armory. It boasted reinforced titanium doors, biometric scanners, and a localized security grid completely detached from the main network. Moreau Frost, a ruthless man in his late 50s with silver hair and a tailored charcoal suit, stood behind the primary barricade. He was flanked by 40 heavily armed Delta guards, all holding state-of-the-art rifles loaded with silver nitrate rounds. Moreau was pacing frantically, clutching a secure, encrypted tablet. He was not a warrior. He was a financier. He had spent his life manipulating global markets, funneling the PAC's wealth through offshore accounts at Barclays, and routing untraceable funds through shell companies in the Cayman Islands. He believed that money, not blood, ruled the world. "Hold the perimeter!" Moreau barked, his voice echoing in the cavernous marble hallway of the financial sector. "Captain Reynolds, ensure the thermal sensors are active. If the Alpha King tries to breach the ventilation, shoot to kill. I will not let that arrogant boy destroy decades of wealth over a filthy servant." Captain Reynolds, a battle-hardened Delta whose loyalty had been bought with a hefty offshore deposit, adjusted his grip on his rifle. "Sir, with all due respect, it's Damien Cross, and the scouts reported that he has the war beast off its chains." "It's an animal, Reynolds," Moreau spat, his composure cracking. "A massive, dumb animal. Silver will put it down just like any other dog. I've already contacted the regional directors at Standard Chartered. I've frozen the Iron Ridge operational funds. Damien cannot pay his border armies. By morning, he will be begging me on his knees, and that Omega witch will be dead." A low, rhythmic thudding suddenly echoed down the exterior corridor. It wasn't the sound of marching boots. It was the heavy, terrifying footfalls of something massive. The thermal sensors on the security monitors flickered, then completely whited out, overwhelmed by an immense heat signature approaching the titanium blast doors. Moreau stopped pacing. The 40 guards raised their weapons, the collective click of safeties disengaging, sounding like a death rattle in the tense silence. "He's here," Reynolds whispered, a bead of sweat tracing down his scarred cheek. Outside the barricade, Damien Cross stood with his hands casually shoved into the pockets of his dark trousers. He didn't bring his elite enforcers. He didn't bring Beta Jackson. He brought only himself and Krieger. The Alpha King looked at the massive, 2-foot-thick titanium doors. He could hear the rapid, terrified heartbeats of the Deltas inside. He could smell their sour, acrid fear leaking through the airtight seals. "Moreau." Damien's voice was barely louder than a conversational tone, yet the alpha frequencies cut straight through the reinforced steel, vibrating directly into the skulls of the men inside. "I gave you 10 minutes. You have spent 8 of them sweating. Inside, Moreau snatched a localized PA microphone. Stand down, Damien. You are outmatched. I hold the purse strings of this entire syndicate. I have frozen the Barclays accounts and halted the logistics supply chain. Surrender the Omega to me, reinstate my daughter, and I will restore your empire. Damien let out a dark, humorless chuckle that sent a shiver down the spine of every guard. You think you hold my empire, Moreau? Damien replied, his voice dropping into a lethal demonic register. My empire is not built on fiat currency or offshore accounts. It is built on blood. It is built on absolute, undeniable power. And you just threatened my queen. Damien took a step back, casually gesturing to the massive blast doors. He didn't look at the beast beside him. He simply gave a single, quiet command. Open it, Krieger. The war beast let out a deafening roar that shook dust from the vaulted ceilings. Krieger didn't charge the doors. He reared up on his hind legs, his massive, shadow-black frame towering 15 feet in the air, and slammed his front paws directly into the center of the titanium. The sound of the impact was catastrophic. The 2-foot-thick metal buckled inward with a shrieking groan. The structural integrity of the fortress, designed to withstand a direct missile strike, failed instantly under the ancient, unnatural physical force of the beast. Krieger drove his razor-sharp, bone-crushing claws into the seam of the doors. Muscles the size of boulders bulged beneath his matted black fur as he wrenched his massive shoulders apart. Inside the barricade, Captain Reynolds screamed as the titanium doors were literally ripped off their hinges. One of the massive steel slabs flew through the air, completely obliterating the defensive sandbags and crushing 3 guards instantly. Krieger stepped into the breach. His glowing amber eyes swept over the terrified deltas, his jaws unhinged, saliva dripping onto the marble floor. Fire! Fire! Moreau shrieked, dropping his tablet and backing away. Dozens of silver nitrate rounds tore through the air, striking Krieger's chest and shoulders. But the beast wasn't a werewolf. The silver didn't burn him. It merely annoyed him. The bullets flattened against his impenetrable hide and dropped uselessly to the floor. Krieger lunget. He didn't kill them. Damien hadn't ordered a massacre, but he swatted Captain Reynolds across the room with a single, brutal flick of his paw, sending the man crashing into a concrete pillar, unconscious. The beast's roar paralyzed the remaining guards. Their wolves whimpered in submission, forcing the men to drop their weapons and fall to their knees, pressing their foreheads to the marble floor in absolute, primal terror. Damien stepped slowly through the ruined doorway, stepping over the shattered titanium. The air around him was so heavy with alpha dominance that the marble floor literally cracked beneath his boots. Moreau Frost was backed into a corner, his tailored suit ruined by dust, his hands shaking violently as he stared at the Alpha King and the monster towering behind him. Please, Moreau choked out, all of his arrogance evaporating. Please, Alpha. The accounts. I can unfreeze them. I can transfer the Cayman assets back to the Central Trust. Just name your price. Damien stopped 3 feet away from the cowering financier. His ice-blue eyes were utterly devoid of mercy. My price, Damien said softly, is your life. Before Moreau could scream, Damien's hand shot out, his fingers wrapping around the man's throat, lifting him entirely off the ground. Moreau kicked and thrashed, his face turning a mottled purple. You are stripped of your rank. You are stripped of your wealth, Damien growled, his fangs descending slightly. Every asset you hold will be liquidated and distributed to the Omega class. You and your daughter will spend the rest of your miserable lives in the silver-lined subterranean cells. If you ever speak my mate's name again, I will let Krieger have your spine for a chew toy. Damien tossed the man aside like a piece of garbage. Moreau hit the wall and collapsed, gasping for air, utterly broken. Jackson, Damien called out over his shoulder. Beta Jackson Ward stepped through the rubble, flanked by a dozen elite enforcers who looked at the destruction with wide, terrified eyes. Clean this up, Damien ordered, adjusting his cuffs. Secure the perimeter, and send a message to the Barclays regional director. Tell them the Iron Ridge accounts are under new management. If they hesitate, tell them the Alpha King will pay them a personal visit. Without waiting for a response, Damien turned and walked back out of the ruined fortress. He had a mate to return to. 3 days passed. The Iron Ridge pack had undergone a seismic, terrifying shift. The Solstice Gala's bloody conclusion and the immediate, brutal crushing of the Delta Rebellion had sent shockwaves through the entire syndicate. The Omegas, previously invisible and abused, were suddenly elevated, moved from the damp basements into the sunny, newly renovated Eastern Wing. Moreau's liquidated assets funded top-tier medical care, better food, and proper wages. But the pack was incredibly restless. They had an Omega on the throne, or so they thought. They hadn't seen Nora since Damien carried her from the arena. In the royal penthouse, high above the compound, Nora stood in front of a floor-to-ceiling mirror. She was barely recognizable. The soot and grime were gone, her skin glowing with a newfound health, though she remained slender. Her right arm was still secured in a sleek, carbon fiber sling, but her posture had changed. The crushing weight of survival had been lifted, replaced by a strange, humming energy deep in her blood. She wore a simple, elegant emerald green dress that brought out the gold flecks in her hazel eyes. Damien stood behind her, his large hands resting gently on her waist. He buried his face in her neck, inhaling her sweet, vanilla and rain-washed pine scent, placing a soft kiss against her mating mark, a crescent-shaped scar he had claimed her with the night before, sealing their bond. "You're shaking," Damien murmured, his voice a soothing rumble against her skin. "I'm terrified, Damien," Nora admitted, leaning back against his solid chest. "Dr. Gable explained the Volkrad bloodline to me. I understand what it means. But the pack, they still see me as the girl scrubbing blood off the arena floor. They won't accept me just because you command it." Damien turned her around gently, looking deeply into her eyes. "They will accept you because you are a queen, Nora. Not just by my side, but by your own divine right. The blood in your veins commanded a beast that slaughtered armies. You don't need to demand their respect. You just need to show them who you are." A sharp knock on the heavy oak doors interrupted them. Beta Jackson stepped inside, his face grim. "Alpha." "Luna." Jackson bowed deeply, a gesture of profound respect that still made Nora blush. "We have a situation at the main gates. Alpha Kalen Croft of the Blood Moon Syndicate has arrived unannounced. He brought a vanguard of 200 elite warriors. He claims he heard rumors that a servant tamed your warbeast. He says if the Iron Ridge pack is weak enough to put an Omega on the throne, he is here to challenge you for the Northern Territories." Damien's jaw clenched, his eyes instantly flashing a dangerous black. "Croft has been looking for an excuse to cross the border for 2 years. Tell the snipers to lock onto his vanguard. I will rip his throat out in the courtyard." "No," Nora said. The single word was spoken softly, but it carried a strange, echoing resonance that made both Damien and Jackson freeze. Nora stepped away from Damien, her hazel eyes suddenly swirling with a faint, luminous gold. The dormant power of the Volkrad line, awakened by the mating bite, was finally rising to the surface. "He isn't here for you, Damien," Nora said, her voice steady, completely devoid of the fear that had ruled her life just days ago. "He's here because he smells the shift in power. If you kill him, his pack will retaliate. It will be a bloodbath. I won't let my first act as Luna be a war." Damien looked at his mate, utterly captivated by the fierce, regal aura radiating from her small frame. "What do you want to do, my queen?" "Let him in," Nora commanded, looking at Jackson. "Bring him to the central courtyard. I will meet him." 10 minutes later, the central courtyard was completely silent. Thousands of Iron Ridge wolves lined the balconies, watching intensely. Alpha Kalen Croft, a massive, heavily scarred man with a brutal reputation, stood in the center of the cobblestones, flanked by his highest-ranking enforcers. The heavy oak doors of the royal keep opened. Damien stepped out first, but he did not take the lead. He stepped to the side, allowing Nora to walk out ahead of him. She walked slowly, her chin held high, the emerald dress flowing around her ankles, and right beside her, walking perfectly in sync with her steps, was Krieger. The warbeasting was a walking nightmare in the daylight. His bone spurs gleamed, and his massive paws struck the stones with heavy, deliberate thuds. Alpha Croft laughed, a harsh, mocking sound. "Is this a joke, Cross? You hide behind a broken servant girl and a chained mutt?" Nora didn't stop until she was 20 feet from the rival Alpha. She looked Kalen Croft directly in the eyes. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't need to. "He is not chained," Nora said, her voice carrying an ancient, terrifying authority that made the air pressure in the courtyard instantly drop. Nora slowly raised her good hand. She didn't look at Krieger. She simply released a fraction of the Volkrad energy humming in her veins. Krieger let out a roar that eclipsed anything the pack had ever heard. It wasn't just loud, it was psychic. It was a shockwave of ancient, primal power that shattered the glass in the surrounding windows. The beast lunged forward, moving faster than the eye could track, and slammed his massive paws onto the cobblestones just inches from Alpha Croft. Krieger unhinged his jaws, staring down at the rival Alpha, entirely ready to bite the man in half. Croft stumbled backward, his face draining of all color. His own wolf, sensing the ancient, apex predator and the divine royal bloodline radiating from the tiny woman behind the beast, completely surrendered. Against his own will, Alpha Kalen Croft dropped to his knees on the hard stone, his hands shaking. His 200 elite warriors immediately followed, collapsing to their knees in absolute submission to the Volkrad Queen. Nora lowered her hand. Krieger snapped his jaws shut, backing up to sit loyally at her side, resting his massive head gently against her hip. The entire Iron Ridge pack, watching from the balconies, didn't cheer. They didn't roar. In complete awestruck silence, thousands of wolves dropped to one knee, bowing their heads. They finally understood. She wasn't an Omega. She was a god among wolves. Damien walked up behind her, wrapping his arms around her waist, a fiercely proud smile on his face. "You have your answer, Alpha Croft." Damien projected his voice over the kneeling crowd. "The Northern Territories belong to the Iron Ridge Pack, and the Iron Ridge Pack belongs to the true queen. Now, get off our lands." Croft scrambled to his feet, bowing hastily before fleeing with his vanguard, the threat of war completely extinguished by a single, unbroken girl. Nora leaned her head back against Damien's shoulder, letting out a long, shaky breath as the adrenaline faded. "Is it over?" she whispered. Damien kissed her temple, his arms tightening around her. "No, my love, it's just beginning." The era of cruelty within the Iron Ridge Pack was buried that day. Under Nora's reign, the Syndicate transformed from a ruthless military dictatorship into a prosperous, fiercely loyal empire. The caste system was abolished, and the wealth hoarded by the Deltas was poured into education, medical research, and infrastructure. Toby recovered fully, growing into a strong, mischievous boy who often rode on the back of the terrifying war beast through the compound gardens. Moreau and Seraphina Frost remained in their silver-lined cells, a permanent reminder of the price of arrogance. As for Damien, the Iron King finally found his peace. He no longer ruled through fear, but through the absolute, unwavering devotion he held for his mate. Nora Hastings, the broken Omega who fell into the fighting pit, had not just tamed the war beast, she had healed an entire kingdom.